Thank you, Charlie. And good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation by Dr. Paul Curtis entitled Deer Management, Where Do We Go From Here? My name is Suzanne Barclay, and I'm the Executive Director of Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rockland. Tonight, we're excited to have Dr. Curtis speak. He has a wealth of knowledge and experience in wildlife management in general, and specifically in deer. This is the fourth in our Sustainable Suburbia series that is funded by a grant from the School of Integrated Plant Science at Cornell's College of Agriculture and Life Science, known as CALS. This series of workshops addresses three major environmental issues here in Rockland. We describe them as rampant invasive plant growth, our limited water supply, and an overabundance of deer. Invasive plant species have established themselves throughout the county, from the Phragmites that have overtaken the Piermont Marsh, the Japanese knotweed you see all along our rail trails, and barberry up and down the Palisades Interstate Parkway. These plants are changing our local environments and will potentially affect and/or replace our local flora and fauna. Our second issue is our drinking water supply, which is essentially limited to the rainfall that falls within our own borders and is captured in our reservoirs like Lake Tapan or absorbed in our aquifers and wells. Earlier in the year, just before the pandemic shut everything down, the Rockland Water Task Force released their newly created water conservation plan. And in this plan, there's a role for everyone in Rockland, businesses, government officials, and you as a community member to understand our water supply first and to learn how to conserve it. And you'll be hearing more from us about this issue in a new series that we're starting next year. But perhaps our biggest environmental issue right here in Rockland, at least I think, is our deer population. And even though a good 1/4 of our land area is protected parkland, deer can be found everywhere in suburban backyards, village downtowns, as well as in our parks and woodland areas. And because they need to eat some 8 to 12 pounds of vegetation every day, they are literally consuming the understory in our woodlands and significantly affecting our ecosystem. Our speaker, Dr. Paul Curtis, is a professor and the department extension leader at Cornell's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. And for the past 29 years, he's overseen the Wildlife Damage Management Program. He specializes in human-wildlife conflict and wildlife in suburbia and agricultural areas. He's conducted a number of studies on population management of deer and forest regeneration and has written extensively on the issue. After Dr. Curtis's presentation, we'll open the floor for questions. And because we have a large audience, we'll manage questions using the Q&A box that Charlie mentioned earlier. So just look for that at the bottom of your screen. You simply click on it, and then you can type in your question and press enter, and I'll make sure that Dr. Curtis hears it. And at the very end, we'll present an online survey, which is a chance for you to give us feedback. We'll ask you to take a few minutes to complete it. But if you have to leave early somehow or you don't complete it, not to worry, I can email it to you. And finally, I want to thank our communications manager, Charlie Payne, who makes sure these presentations happen, and our horticultural educator, Kristen Osman, who has partnered with me on our Sustainable Suburbia series. So without further ado, again, thank you for attending tonight, and I'll now turn the floor over to Dr. Curtis.
Thank you much, Suzanne and Charlie, for your help with the technology tonight. I'm going to try to share my screen here at the moment so we can dive right in. I've got a lot that I'd like to cover tonight, and hopefully everyone will learn a bit about deer management. So you should be seeing the title slide, Sustainable Suburbia, Deer Research and Management. And what I'd like to do first is go over research that I've been involved with the past couple of decades in and around the Ithaca area on dealing with overabundant deer. And then I'd like to finish up this evening talking with some things that homeowners can do in your own backyard to try to prevent damage and what works and what doesn't. So let's dive right in. People throughout New York State have a long history with deer, from back to the old hunt camps of the 1800s to recreational feeding of deer in the North Country years ago when that was still legal. But more and more deer are getting into all sorts of conflicts in suburbia, such as the buck in this home construction site right near campus one day. So deer are getting in and creating more problems in recent years as their numbers have grown in many parts of New York State. New York State Department of Environmental Conservation manages deer abundance. These are harvest data collected by DEC, the legal takes of bucks and does across the state over the past couple of decades. Deer numbers peaked statewide in the early 2000s. DEC rapidly increased the number of antlerless tags to try to get the herd in check. Managing does is the way the state tries to control regulation of deer population growth. With a larger number of antlerless tags and buck tag during 2002, 3, 4, you can see the harvest and deer numbers drop in the state. And since then, it's leveled off with a harvest of about 220, 240,000 deer pretty consistently. Now that's the big picture. You know, what happens though is this is all based on harvest. So the data work really well in rural counties in New York State, but in counties like Rockland and Westchester, Suffolk on Eastern Long Island, where deer are less accessible to hunting, the modeling and the programs don't work quite as well. Deer density, you're all aware, varies dramatically depending where you're at in the state. The Adirondacks and the high elevation parts of the Catskills have the lowest density of deer. And again, the state uses deer harvest density as an index to abundance. The west central part of the state has some of the highest densities, as does the lower Hudson Valley and Long Island. But yet the densities in lower Hudson Valley and Long Island don't show up that large because, again, most of those deer being in very urban areas are not accessible to harvest. So again, the data don't track very well in highly residential areas. What we're up against is deer population growth. Deer have the capacity to grow 50 to 60% a year under good conditions with no predation and plenty of food available. So a deer population, even under normal urban conditions, can double in size every 2 to 3 years. So you've got to remove 40, 50, 60% of the deer that are in the landscape from year to year just to stabilize a herd from growing. It's just what we're up against with an adult doe on average producing 2 fawns, and some of our urban deer under good forage conditions having triplets. There's just dramatic potential for growth. Most of the regulations written to manage deer in New York State, again, are for managing deer at broad scales. At the state level, the wildlife management unit level, or the town level, things like hunting tags or deer management permits, bonus deer permits, special seasons, antlerless only bow or muzzleloader seasons, those all work great on a large regional basis or on a town scale in many cases, but they don't solve the deer problem in your backyard. When you get down to a specific neighborhood or a specific property, the only tools DEC really has at their disposal are deer management assistance program tags or deer damage permits, and those are usually issued to forest or farm owners with 50 or more acres, and again allow antlerless deer take either within hunting season with DMAPs or outside of hunting season with deer damage permits, but they're not going to solve the typical problem in the urban backyard in most cases. So why are we concerned about deer overabundance? And there are several main drivers I want to talk about. Most urban areas, particularly this time of year, have high levels of deer vehicle collisions, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. It's estimated New Yorkers hit 70,000 plus deer a year on our highways, and that number is just a very rough ballpark. It's probably an underestimate. In terms of crop damage, we did a survey back in the 2000s when deer populations were high, partnering with Ag and Markets and Farm Bureau. And back then, based on our surveys from growers, we estimated deer damage cost New York farm growers $49 million a year in crop losses. Huge economic impact. On the home landscape, deer browse all sorts of woody ornamentals and native plants. You can see the browse lines on the taxus in the picture in the upper right, about 5.5 feet above ground. That's how high deer can typically reach when they're feeding. The lower right, forest regeneration failure. I've seen places in the Catskills and Southern Tier where the area was cut, appropriate silviculture was done to regenerate a forest, and nothing happens because deer constantly browse the new stems off at snow level every winter, and it causes a complete lack of regeneration. And that affects birds, it affects salamanders as you remove brushy cover and dry out the forest floor, it affects other species. And if native plants don't fill in light gap, you get invasive barberry and other species that black-legged ticks that carry Lyme disease like. So in areas where you have high incidence of invasive barberries and high numbers of deer, you tend to have high incidence of Lyme disease. So all sorts of issues associated with deer. So what can we do? What do we have in our management toolbox? Well, if you're not going to do any population control and do nothing and live with the issues, on your individual property, homeowners can try repellents to protect their plant materials or fence deer out of their yards completely. Want to mention feeding deer in New York State is illegal, and you definitely can be ticketed for feeding deer within 300 feet of a public road. That's a conservation law that's been on the books for many years. So we want to control deer abundance. What do we have? Well, we've got two groups, lethal and non-lethal methods. Some people say, well, let's just introduce predators and bring back the natural balance. And the issue with that is predators take more than deer, and there's good reason that wolves and mountain lions and other large predators don't belong in suburban areas. Capture and kill or bait and shoot. Several communities have tried these programs, some successful, and we'll talk more about those tools. Traditional hunting programs are part of the solution. And again, they work best in more rural counties where there's greater access to deer. They tend to not work as well in highly urbanized areas where you can't hunt with firearms, or even bull hunting may be restricted. Controlled hunting, I'll talk about that, where you require hunters to shoot female deer before they can take a buck in order to try to get check on the herd. Those programs have been used. And finally, I put up commercial hunting, the question mark. Not legal now, but some wildlife agencies and some professionals have been discussing that as a potential alternative to try to get ahead of overabundant deer. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but at least those discussions are being underway now. In terms of non-lethal methods, habitat alteration, if you get a high enough density of concrete and industrial and residential development and you lose green space, you're eventually going to lose deer. They've got to have enough cover to protect them over winter and have places for refuge and resting. But most people enjoy green spaces in suburbia, and we don't want to change those habitats. Capture and relocate, where many parts of the state are above goal density and there's nowhere to move deer. DEC is very unlikely and usually unwilling to give any permits to capture and relocate. It's also expensive and could cause injury to a small percentage of animals. Fertility control is often brought up, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. You can do transient fertility control with things like immunocontraception or permanent surgical sterilization. And I've worked with both, and neither one is really a panacea to solve this problem. We'll get into some data in a short while. So fertility control, it's considered experimental. To do it in New York State, DEC requires that you have a LCP, a research permit. It's called a license to collect and possess. We've had several of those. We studied this over the years on and around campus. Theoretically, it's possible. You can capture enough female deer in a relatively small area and sterilize them. But so far, it's been relatively unproven in the field. If the community's got enough money, we could be biologically feasible. It just depends on how much you want to spend. Typical surgery under research protocols cost about $1,200 a deer. And I'll show you some data in a minute on why it's so expensive. Usually done on females only, although in Staten Island, there was a big experiment on trying to sterilize all the bucks. The latest data that I saw from Staten Island indicated that over the last several years, 3 to 4 years, they've spent about $4 million on about a 20% population reduction. I think that money could have been better spent in a whole lot of other ways, but that was a political decision. Fertility control has a limited scale. It's not going to replace hunting. It's not going to be affordable on a broad basis. And so it's going to be something an individual community that has the resources might want to try working with DEC and with their biologists. But you'll see I wouldn't necessarily spend money there. I don't think it's a viable long-term alternative because it requires maintenance, and we'll talk more about that. We've done quite a bit of modeling, and although it looks really complicated, it's not. Top line is fawns, male fawns, male yearlings, male adults, and survivorship parameters between the years. The middle row is female fawns, yearlings, and adult. If you catch a female fawn and sterilize her as a yearling in S1, she's a sterilized N. And once a female is sterilized, the only thing that carries in between age classes is survivorship. So you could easily parameterize a model like this if you know survival rates and reproductive rates and make very good predictions on how many deer you need to handle in an area to come up with a prediction on how quickly sterilization might work. And we've done that. And we know from many years of research in deer in Suburbia, in Ithaca, in Cayuga Heights, in Fort Drum, and other places around the state, that urban deer have high survival rates because they're typically not exposed to the same level of hunting mortality as other places. And they also tend to have high birth rates, higher than average, because they have lush urban vegetation to feed on. They've got garden plants, they've got landscape ornamentals, they've got bird seed, they've got all these other sources of food that deer don't see when they're in the big woods. And so that increases their birth rates, and that's why most adult does in suburban areas produce twins, and about 10 to 15% produce triplets. So it increases that population growth curve. Well, what's that mean for sterilization rates? Well, if you look at the zero line, that's no change in population. Each of the colored lines is a goal reduction in population. The left axis is time in years, the x-axis, bottom axis is sterilization rate, y-axis is time in years to achieve the goal. So let's say you wanted to reduce the deer abundance in Rockland County by 60%, and you wanted to do it in 4 years. So I go over here to the left axis to 4, go across to the blue line where it hits 60%, and go down to the sterilization rate. What I see is under best case scenario, I need to sterilize 95% of the female deer in Rockland County in order to achieve a 60% population reduction in 4 years. That's just simply not doable. You don't have access to that number of deer, you can't afford to do it. And the other big takeaway is some folks have experimented with fertility control and treated small number of deer. To just get to the zero line, no population change, you have to sterilize between 45 and 50% of the female deer just to keep the population stable. And so that's why fertility control is so difficult. When I've actually tested these models on the Cornell campus, what we see is that you've got to maintain sterilization rates of at least 95% in your research area across 4 to 5 years to have any hope of achieving a reduction. And even then, we weren't all that successful. So what we wanted to do was sort of test these models that we've developed. So this map probably doesn't mean a lot, but the blue area is the core campus area, Cornell University in Ithaca. It's on the east side of town. That blue area represents about 1,100 acres, almost a couple of square miles. Plus, Cornell owns all the red areas. Those are agricultural fields that we use for research, woodlots, natural areas, other essentially forested or agricultural areas that the university owns and maintains. So what we decided to do was sterilized deer on core campus to test the models to see if we could get a population reduction on that couple of square miles. And at the same time, hunt deer as hard as we could on the other Cornell lands to try to cut off immigration into the sterilization zone, try to make it as effective as possible. So we captured deer. We used dart rifles. We used clover traps, which are those netted box cages that you see on the right. Every deer that we caught had ear tags. For the adult does and many of the yearling does, we put radio collars on them so we could monitor survivorship and movements and understand where suburban deer live, what they do, how they survive. This is just a photo of one of our adult does, number 212, and her yearling doe offspring that's just been darted. If you look in the rump of that deer, you can see the dart right here. She's about ready to go to sleep, and she's going to get surgically sterilized also. And so once the deer falls asleep, sometimes it's on campus, sometimes it's on backyards and neighboring properties, and we'd have to go knock on doors and ask people if we could get permission to go in the yard to recover our darted deer, hobble them, blindfold them, carrying them to a pickup truck, and then head to large animal surgery at the veterinary college. We had a surgical team, residents and faculty that were trained to sterilize deer quickly and efficiently as possible, similar as they would any other large animal. We started off with ovarectomies. The veterinarians were concerned that that might change hormone function for the female deer we were going to release. So they instead changed the tubal ligations for the bulk of our surgeries because it was quicker and easier, and the ovaries were intact and maintained normal hormone function. And then post-recovery, we went out and about an hour after surgery, released deer back to the field into their home range. And again, most of the adult does were ear tagged and radio collared after surgery. So what did we find? Over a 6-year period, we did 93 surgeries and had between 90 to 95% of all the female deer on core campus sterilized. That's 77 adult does, 16 female fawns. North and south of campus in our local communities, we had 26 marked with unsterilized control does. We essentially trapped those does, put radio collars and ear tags on them to look at, to have a control group so we could compare fawning rates and survivorship to our surgery animals. And what happened over that 6-year period? Of about 119 deer that we had marked, 82 died during that 6 years. 32 were hit by cars. 36 got into a huntable area near campus and were taken legally by a hunter. And that's pretty much what happens. You're in urban deer. You either get hit by a car or you walk into an area where it's legally available to take and harvest. Very few animals die of any other causes. And so we lost a lot of deer. You would expect that population is going to drop. In addition to the surgery, we started a controlled deer hunting program, as I mentioned, in those red areas near campus. 2008 was our pilot year. We had an earn a buck program where we were encouraging our hunters to take adult does and does to reduce reproductive rates. And so over the first 7 years of this study, we took 777 deer legally with hunters, mostly females. Well over 2/3 of those animals that were harvested were female from those red zones adjacent to campus to try to shut down immigration. Our hunter success rates dropped as we removed more deer. You can see the average hours hunted per successful deer was 49 in the first year. That went above 80 hours by the time we were in 2012, 13, and 14. And the percent of successful hunters dropped from 38% down to 18, 19% in later years. So deer were becoming more scarce. It was getting more difficult to harvest them, but that didn't mean there were fewer deer. The way we know that is we did camera surveys within the sterilization zone on core campus. We'd set out about a dozen cameras with baited apple piles each winter. Deer would come in, they take their own pictures because we had a high proportion of deer on campus tag. We could run those camera data through a mark recapture computer model and then come up with a very good indications of abundance. And what we were seeing as we went through this year to year is that we kept removing lots of deer, we kept sterilizing lots of deer, but the numbers didn't seem to be getting any smaller. And that we were sort of scratching our heads about that. So for 4 years of the camera data, each year, each winter when we set the cameras out and the deer, we got the deer photos, we get about 2,000 pictures of deer in 7 days on campus. And so for each year, we pulled 500 photos at random and just counted the buck, does, and fawns in those pictures just to get a sense of how the population was changing over time. Again, just an index. These aren't actual numbers of deer on campus. But you can see doe numbers were going down from an index of about 486 down to 300. Fawns really dropped off with the sterilization. 340 fawns in the 500 photos the first year, down to 47 or 73 the last couple of years. But look what happened to the bucks. We started off the first year with only 22 bucks in those 500 pictures, and by the time we got to 2012, we had 214 bucks in those 500 images. And so everything that we were doing on the female side was completely counteracted by the bucks. And it was something, a collateral impact that we had not considered. That's why we do research. What happened when we changed surgeries and went from ovarectomies to tubal ligations, that meant does continued to cycle. In a normal deer herd, essentially 95% of the does are likely bred by the middle of December, and you don't have any cycling female deer in January, February, and early March. But by having deer, most of our female deer on campus with tubal ligations, those females continued to cycle because they weren't pregnant and they couldn't get pregnant. But they continued to cycle and come into estrus until photo period shuts estrus down at the end of February, beginning of March. So we had the only does in the county that were still in essentially breeding condition during January and February, and the bucks quickly figured that out. And so an unexpected surprise negated everything that we had done on the female side because we hadn't anticipated that in advance. We also looked at different ways to assess deer impact. Deer vehicle accidents are a big consideration of most communities. And even though we shot 770 plus deer in and around campus with our hunting program, sterilized another almost 100 deer, deer vehicle accidents continued to go up. We weren't reducing those at all. We worked with Dr. Baron Blasi in the right photo on an oak sentinel seedling project. We wanted to have a way to indicate how deer were impacting plant communities. And oaks are a seedling which deer like, sort of middle palatability range. They readily take them if they're available. And so Baron would go out each spring and plant oaks in paired sets, one oak in a protected cage like you see on the left, and another one that was left unprotected. And we had several plots of these around campus, and it ends up being that it's a very good indicator on deer browsing intensity in native woodlands, since red oak's a native tree species. And we published this in 2019 in Ecology and Evolution. But just as an example from our plots on the Cornell golf course, if you look at the exclude one, occasionally a rodent will get in and kill a seedling, or a seedling will die from desiccation, but otherwise they pretty much survive very well. But if you look at the ones in the open, 90 days after planting, of the 20 seedlings on this one plant that were left open, there were only 3 left. Deer had eaten the other 17. So we were at the point, even after all this work, where we couldn't even grow an oak tree on our own woodlots on campus, and other sensitive wildflowers and other tree seedlings like maple and ash were being heavily impacted by deer over browsing. So we decided we had to get more aggressive. We just stopped the sterilization program, continued the hunting program adjacent to campus, and then we applied for a DEC deer damage permit, and it was granted. And what that does is allows us to take deer outside the normal hunting season in areas on campus that are non-hunting areas because their hunters can't routinely get into those sites. We handpicked our shooters. It was archery only, initially for antlerless deer only. We baited deer into safe shooting zones on campus. We used lights with our bows for shooting until 11 p.m. at night. Only bows and crossbows were authorized by Cornell police. We had to follow all environmental conservation laws and mandated discharge distances, 250 feet from buildings for crossbows, 150 feet for vertical bows. And DEC gave us a number of tags each year, usually around 50 tags during the initial year. We took 34 deer 2013-14, nearly every animal at night. And then the second year of the deer damage permit, we took 37 deer with archery equipment, and they were all at night. Just shows one of our shooters putting out corn near a bait site during the winter months. We did this mostly in February and early March when there was snow on the ground and deer were easily attracted to bait. If animals were lost by a shooter, we had trained tracking dogs that we used to try to recover every deer possible and not leave any animals in the woods if it was wounded. So the tracking dogs were a big help. And what did we learn? During 2009 to 2013, during the years we were doing our sterilization program, these are the actual population estimates from our computer simulation from tagged deer in and around core campus, that 2 square mile area. And you can see numbers were slowly creeping up from the low 90s to 105 deer by 2013, even though we had 95% of the female deer sterilized. You'd say, well, how's this possible? And what it is, as we realized, because most all of our deer were tagged, we had a very high immigration rate, and deer were coming into our sterilization zone from surrounding communities. And we learned between 12 and 20 new deer a year were coming in addition to the bucks that were coming in because of the does that were still in estrus in late winter. After 2 years of our bait and shoot program with archery equipment, we had cut that population about in half, but we haven't been able to get any lower than that at this point, even though we continue the bait and shoot program and we continue the regular hunting program. It's just that many of those deer are still inaccessible, and they've learned and they just don't come into bait sites. So we still have not reached goal density, which was less than 20 deer on entire core campus was our goal density, and we haven't been able to get there. So urban deer management presents lots of challenges. Cost is a big one. If you're going to look at things like fertility control, it's at least $1,200 a deer just to do the initial surgery, not less to follow up on all the other research. You can easily spend a few $100,000 pretty quickly. Safety is a huge issue. People want to know if you're having a hunting program in an urban area, whether it's gun or whether it's archery, that everyone's going to be safe. So you have to work very closely with local police departments. And so that's the last bullet point. We work very closely with Cornell police, and all of our deer damage permit sites on campus were reviewed and approved by Cornell University Police as safe shooting zone. And we've never had any issues in the entire 10 plus years we've been working on this program. Never had a safety issue because we take that very seriously. We have to also consider public values. We had people that protested our hunting program and protested our bait and shoot program, but we've been able to continue that even though that not everybody wants to see those actions happen, which means we have to have good communication, both internally with campus administration and externally with all of our local stakeholders, so people know what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and that we're doing it as best we possibly can to be using the most humane techniques possible. Access to deer is key. No matter how much money you have or no matter what you want to do, if you can't get a deer in hand or in a safe shooting zone, you're not going to be able to do much with that animal from a management standpoint. And that's what gets to be really tricky in some urban areas. Laws and discharge distances still have to be followed. As I mentioned, the discharge distance for crossbows and vertical bows. For firearms, the discharge distance is 500 feet from a home if you don't have landowner's permission to be on that property. You've got to set reasonable goals. We thought, we went into really over optimistic. We thought by sterilizing 90+% of the deer, harvesting hundreds of animals, we'd quickly be able to reduce the deer population in and around core campus, but they showed us completely different. It was not a success. We continue to work at it to this day, but I want to emphasize that any type of urban deer management like this is very challenging at best. And there's no silver bullet, no quick fix solution. It's something that you've got to work at year after year and essentially do everything you can to try to reduce abundance and stay ahead of that population growth curve. So what I recommend for communities, if you want to get into intensive deer management, first, develop assessment methods so the effectiveness of your management can be validated. Whether you're using camera surveys, look at abundance, plant indicator, it doesn't really matter, but you've got to have some metric to know whether your program's working or it's not. I encourage communities to avoid non-lethal methods such as immunocontraception and sterilization. They show really little promise in areas where deer can move freely. And that's what we were up against on campus because immigration just allowed bucks and does to move in where we had sterilized animals or move into our hunting areas from surrounding good habitat every year. So it's just a never-ending number of deer on the landscape. You're going to need to develop local expertise. This is beyond normal deer management, and you're either going to have to work with a biologist, with an agency, or maybe a retired biologist that has time on their hand. One of our local communities has a faculty member who volunteers his time helping them develop programs, but you're going to need some type of expertise to make a program work successfully. Community support is essential. You've got to have both political will and funding behind the program, or otherwise it's not going to be successful. People have to support what you're doing. And what I always emphasize to any community, once you start, some form of deer management is going to be needed to be maintained for the foreseeable future. And I've seen so many communities waste time and money because they don't take this into effect. They get all gung-ho and get a program started, put $100,000 into doing some form of population control, whether it's a cull or a hunt or experimentation with fertility control, have some success, and then say, okay, we solved that problem and go on to the next thing. Well, managing deer is like mowing the lawn. The grass continues to grow every summer. Same with deer, the herd continues to grow each year, either through fawn production or immigration. So it's something that you've got to make. If you reach a goal, you're still going to have to continue management every year. The communities who are most successful are the ones who have a line in their budget that says deer management, and they plan to do it every year and not slow down on the program once they get to goal density. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk a bit more about what you can do as an individual homeowner or landowner to try to resolve conflicts in your backyard. What I've done so far is really describe community level programs where you're doing aggressive population management, but most people can't do that in their own half-acre, quarter-acre lot around home. No matter what community I go into, there's one of three drivers that are usually causing deer management to come to the forefront. It's either deer vehicle collisions, concerns about Lyme disease, or concerns about plant damage, either landscape ornamentals or sometimes natural vegetation in parks and forest land. That's usually one, if not all of those three drivers are what get people upset about deer and want active deer management. And I tried to summarize 30 years of research in the paper that I listed there on the slide this past year, because communities throughout the country are no different than folks in Rockland County. People throughout the eastern United States are struggling with the same problem and have the same drivers. It doesn't matter where I go in the eastern US. Deer vehicle collisions, let's start there. We know from the National Crash Database that 200 or more people lose their lives every year in deer-related vehicle accidents. That's a huge number. Some of them probably could be avoided. And the larger states like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, where you have lots of people and lots of road miles, usually we see 2 or 3 fatalities a year at least in deer-related vehicle accidents. So it's really an issue that you've got to pay attention to. We know from years of DEC data collection that the peak of deer vehicle accidents is right now, actually this week as we talk. This is the peak of the rut. The peak of the breeding season in central and western New York occurs around November 9th, 10th, 11th every year. And as you can see, as you get to the peak of the rut, you get to the peak of deer vehicle accidents. These data are based on tags that used to be issued when a motorist killed a deer and DEC would issue a tag for him to take the carcass. Old data, but the pattern is true today as it was back in the 1980s. Excuse me. So deer vehicle collisions start to peak in mid to late October as we approach the rut, the peak of breeding season. They always peak in November. They start to come down in December, and then by January and through much of the rest of the year, they're much lower than those 3 months. 60% of the deer vehicle accidents that occur on an annual basis occur in October, November, and December around deer breeding season. There's a secondary peak these data miss. Happens right at the, usually at the end of April, into May, just before adult does are going to give birth to their new fawns. They kicked last year's fawns out of their home range. And so that May period, you have yearling deer, bucks and does both, wandering the landscape without their mother for the first time, looking to set up their own home range. And if you're driving the interstate frequently or driving high-speed roads frequently, watch in May, you'll see a little blip in deer vehicle accidents again. Excuse me, because that's a fawn dispersal period that happens every year. So what can we do? How do we reduce deer vehicle accidents? Education is the big thing. We know when they're going to occur. You've got to use extra caution while driving during October, November, and December, and especially around dawn and dusk. Dawn and dusk are the peak periods of deer activity every day. And when we change back to daylight, Eastern Standard Time from daylight savings time, like we did last weekend, that puts the peak of driving in morning and afternoon right at the peak of deer activity around dawn and dusk. So that's another reason accident rates go up this time of year. Note areas where there are deer crossing signs in your normal travel. Deer are very much creatures of habit. Excuse me. And they'll use those traditional road crossings year after year. So pay attention. And when you're driving at night, scan the roadsides for eye reflection. Sometimes you'll see that, silver dollar size flash in your headlights or your bright lights at a distance. That'll give you just enough time to slow down to avoid hitting a deer crossing the road. And I encourage communities to manage deer density wherever possible. It's a probability of contact. Fewer deer per square mile on the landscape mean fewer deer are going to get hit. And so where you have really high densities like you do at Westchester County, Rockland County, Eastern Long Island, you often see very high deer vehicle collision statistics. Ticks are another issue. The black-legged tick, I'm sure almost all of you are aware, transmits Lyme disease, but there are other diseases that are of importance too. Tick abundance tends to be highest in areas where you have high deer abundance, and you also have invasive species like barberry, and so that creates all sorts of issues. But you also have Lone Star ticks, Avioma ticks, and they were first documented on Long Island back in the 70s, but now they're found throughout Long Island, Hudson Valley, and they carry a number of host of other diseases besides Lyme disease. Also, they carry the meat allergy. Some people that get bitten by Lone Star ticks develop an allergy to eating red meat. So the most common diseases that we see are ehrlichiosis in the Lone Star, anaplasmosis or Lyme in the black-legged ticks, occasionally babesiosis with black-legged ticks, Bartonella potentially associated with black-legged ticks. And we've got newer viruses also emerging, things like Powassan virus, very, very low prevalence and distribution. But as deer and tick numbers increase, that you've got to watch to make sure that doesn't spread. So how do you manage for Lyme disease? People say, well, let's do direct reductions in deer numbers. If we have fewer deer, we should have fewer ticks, but it doesn't work that way. Data, at least with black-legged ticks, clearly show in order to have tick populations crash, you need to have less than 10 deer per square mile on the landscape. The typical urban areas around Ithaca here, before we started deer management, were running 100 to 125 deer per square mile. I suspect areas in Rockland County are typically 80 to 125 deer per square mile. So your chances of getting down to less than 10 over wide areas is almost zero. I haven't seen, except for islands where they went in and eradicated deer, I haven't seen communities successfully get deer numbers down low enough to expect tick populations to crash. So that means you're going to have to fence deer to exclude them from sensitive areas. Things like children's playgrounds or maybe some very urban parks that are up against woods. It may make sense to have 8-foot high fencing to keep deer out of those areas so they're not bringing ticks into areas where the ticks could drop off deer and expose children. And we experimented with 4-poster stations, the device you see in this picture. It's essentially a 200-pound corn hopper with paint rollers on springs on each end. And when the deer reaches its head into the feeding trough to get the corn, those paint rollers are sprayed with permethrin by a certified pesticide applicator. So essentially the deer self-medicate themselves with permethrin to kill ticks. Works very effectively. And when you have the appropriate station density in areas we used them on Long Island, we saw numbers of nymphal ticks in our study areas drop by 80 to 90%. Difficulty is with changing label requirements, it's extremely difficult to find places in urban areas where you can put them because they have to have setbacks from houses and places where children might play. Also, they're expensive to buy. They're over $600 a unit and expensive to maintain. We literally put hundreds of thousands of pounds of corn out every year to maintain about 80 devices on Shelter Island when we were doing our research out there. So very expensive way to manage tick abundance and only practical for small areas. You can do some landscaping things that will help. You can create tick safe zones around your yard. Black-legged ticks desiccate easily. They don't do well in mowed open lawns areas. They're going to be found in the brushy areas along the edge of the yard or the woodlot near your home. So if you can create stone or wood chip barriers that are exposed to sunlight, ticks are very unlikely to cross those, and you can help to keep ticks out of the areas in your backyard where you're gardening or where children might play. What else can we do to manage deer? We talked about population management. Let's explore fencing, repellents, and plant selection. We know deer take a variety of ornamental plants, particularly woody ornamentals in the winter months. Back in the 90s, Mike Conover did a national survey, and he estimated back then that deer ate at least $250 million of plant materials annually across the country. And that's a huge underestimate. Back in the 80s, we did a survey in Westchester County, and back then, just Westchester County residents reported losing $6.5 to $9.5 million plant materials. Average plant replacement costs were $475 per home with deer damage. And we learned from that survey that it's the evergreen stuff that the deer like in the winter months: yews, rhododendron, and arborvitae were the plant materials most frequently damaged by deer. So what can we do? Repellents can work when the deer pressure and damage is light. By that I mean deer in the landscape only a month or two out of the year, so it only requires a couple applications. In many parts of the state, we're well beyond that. Fencing or physical barriers provide the only reliable control when deer damage is moderate to heavy. Again, manage herd density. Each adult deer eats 6 to 8 pounds of forage a day, and so the less mouths there are to feed, the less plant materials that get eaten. You can design deer resistant landscapes. We'll talk more about that, but I want to emphasize deer feeding is illegal in New York. To exclude deer out of home gardens, to really keep them out, you need an 8-foot high barrier fence, or in small areas, electric fencing can work well. On the Cornell Arboretum in the upper right, they use individual plant protection with netted cages to protect plants in the collection. And as I mentioned, electric fences can work very well on small home garden plots or small garden areas. We've learned a lot about deer behavior in suburbia over the last 3 decades. We know, again, that deer population density influences damage. In areas like Rockland and Westchester, where you've got very high deer density, you're going to see high levels of damage. Food and cover sources and travel corridors are real important. Deer tend to bed in the same areas day to day and use the same travel corridors and feeding areas. And so one homeowner may put plants out in their yard and the deer don't damage them at all. But you could have another homeowner who's right on a travel corridor, and no matter what they plant, it seems the deer eat it. So deer pressure varies dramatically, even house to house on the same street, depending where the bedding areas and travel corridors are. Season and weather affect deer, what deer will eat. If you get heavy snow load in a really cold winter, they'll take plants that are on the unpalatable list. They're not going to starve. They'll eat whatever's out there. I've seen them eat barberry on a really tough winter when nothing else was available. It was almost zero nutritional value at all. Deer nutrition is important. If they had a good acorn crop and got good fat reserves going into winter, they may not need to feed on many woody ornamentals. If there was a poor acorn crop, poor natural food abundance, they may need to rely more on ornamentals and garden plants. Plant palatability and nutrients are important. Deer seek out nitrogen in the landscape, and a lot of times we heavily fertilize our fruits and vegetables and flowers so they produce lots of growth or lots of vegetables. And deer can sense that high nitrogen and will seek that out. And then previous experience is important. The adult doe often teaches what's good to eat and what's not to her offspring. Deer repellents, there's literally, and this is the shelf of my local farm supply store. There's 30, 40 different products available. Buyer beware. Most of these things have never been tested under research settings. The list on the left are things that we've tested over the years, but even those products, labels have changed so much since we've tested them. It's still difficult to make good recommendations without reading the exact label of the product that you're using. The way we test deer repellents: get balled and burlap Japanese yews. Yews are a favorite winter food of deer. Spray them with different plant materials, leave some out as controls, and put the yews out January, February, and March when the deer are the hungriest, and see which repellents work the best. We take photos of each plant in front of a grid board, the different types of repellent that's used on each one. And a control yew after 2 weeks in the field typically looks like this. And you can see about 60% of the plant surface area has been removed, and deer have munched away every limb down to about the size of the diameter of my thumb. And again, that's would be a completely unacceptable level of damage, but the yews give us a good test plan. What we've learned over the years is that products that contain rotten egg perform the best. So BGR, big game repellent, both in a mix and a spray, is a rotten egg-based material. Deer Off is an egg-based material in this trial. and Deer Stopper 2 was an egg-based material. And all four of those products cluster here on those top line. We had first 4 weeks in the field, no damage at all. But even then, the good repellents start to lose efficacy. By the time you're out to week 8, there's not a significant difference between untreated and treated plants. And the take-home message is, when deer are really hungry during winter months, even the best repellents only last about 4 to 5 weeks. Then you're going to need to respray to freshen that. And if you're in an area like Rockland in a mild winter, you might have a 40-degree sunny day where you could spray. We rarely get that here in upstate New York. And so repellents often don't provide the protection we'd like to see during the entire winter. We also know from surveys that there are a few things that deer tend to avoid. These are starvation foods, things like paperbird, common boxwood, Russian olive, American holly, blue spruce, pieris. These are woody ornamentals you can use if you want to design a deer-resistant landscape, and deer are only going to take these plants if they've got no other food readily available. On the other hand, we know things that are frequently severely damaged. These are plants that deer seek out in the winter landscape, particularly balsam and Fraser fir, the most likely to be damaged is the Christmas tree. Things like English iway, Norway maples, redbuds, white cedar, euonymus dogwood, fruit trees like apples, plums, and cherries, rhododendrons, azaleas, things with big buds they like, yews, mountain ash, arborvitae. Even on a mild winter with relatively low deer densities, often these type of plants will need protection in the home landscape because it's something deer seek out because they really like during the winter months. We've also tested a variety of ornamental bulbs. And so we put those out in pot trays, cafeteria style, in spring in homeowners' backyards with relatively high deer feeding pressure. And deer will go through and pull out the pots and eat the plants that they like. And it gives us a really good measure of what type of spring perennial bulbs are deer resistant and what aren't. And what we found, no big surprise, of all the spring perennial bulbs, deer like tulips the best. And they really love crocuses too. That's Genus 2 and 4, looking at our damage scores. They occasionally take Chianodoxa or Muscaria urcilla, but it's really the tulips and crocuses that deer go after in the spring months. Things like hyacinth, daffodils, irises, allium, a lot of these other spring bulbs, deer rarely take if they've got other plants available. So again, it's possible to design a very deer-resistant landscape if you stay away from tulips and crocuses. We also tested that same group of bulb with our captive vole colony because voles often damage ornamental perennial flowers. And we found that the same plants that tended to be deer resistant were also very vole resistant. In fact, with colchicum, had colchicine in it and actually killed a couple of voles in our colony. We had to stop feeding it to them. And so most of these plants have compounds with them, secondary compounds that prevents herbivores from feeding on them. They're just very distasteful. I'm going to wrap up. We're getting close on time. I want to mention a couple of publications that are available. If you go to my wildlifecontrol.info website, there's a technical guide for managing deer in urban environments. This is written a couple of decades ago, but most of the information in there is still very good and relevant today. And on the right, there's a guide on community-based deer management. Both of these PDF guides are available for free to download and use however you'd like. The community-based deer management guide focuses more on human dimensions and process that you need to consider when managing deer in a community, where the technical guide focuses mostly on management techniques and applications. Another booklet that's available, DEC put this out in 2018 as a community deer management guide. Again, that's available for free at the DEC website. You can download the PDF copy and print it out. And it provides communities with guidance on deer management, what the state allows, what they don't allow, laws and regulation. But it gives you a very good starting place if you're trying to consider a deer management program in your community. So just wanted to make these available. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up. And at this point, I'd be glad to take questions that folks might have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So hopefully I can see folks. So Charlie, Suzanne, are there questions that have come up in the chat so far?
Yes, Paul. But first of all, thank you for that very comprehensive and somewhat discouraging look at deer management. But we had to hear the truth, so thank you for presenting it. So we have one question. This person asked, why not open state lands and parks for hunting?
Depending where you're at in the state, some state lands and parks are already open. Here in the Finger Lakes region, for example, there are several local parks that are open to archery hunting. But it depends on your location in the state, and you really need to talk with your local parks manager to see if you can get it open to at least the bow hunting. Here in the Finger Lakes region, our parks are open to bow hunting for deer, but not gun hunting at this point. So, but that varies depending on state, region, and park manager, but it doesn't hurt to have that discussion.
Okay. Yeah, I think in Rockland, we don't allow bow hunting, partly because residences are so close together. And as you mentioned, I think you have to be 500 feet away from a residence.
That's for firearm, that's true.
Okay.
For a vertical bow, it's 150 feet. The state regulation dropped a few years back. Used to be 500 feet for bows too, but now it's not. So
Okay.
that's making archery hunting more accessible in some urban areas that are fairly tight, like Rockland County.
So the same person asked, how bad was the deer population, say, 30 years ago?
30 years ago, we were just at the cusp of the deer population increasing. A few biologists were warning, and we were seeing the handwriting on the wall that we were at the point where deer were going to hit the exponential part of the growth curve. And other biologists said, no, it's never been a problem. We really didn't take it seriously. And then with the mild winters during the 90s and the early 2000s, and in northern, and particularly in northern states, what really sets deer populations back is the occasional severe winter when we got deep, persistent snow for 60, 90 days during the middle of winter, and you get significant starvation. That's part of the reason deer densities are lower in the Adirondacks and high elevation parts of the Catskills is the deep, persistent snow that they see there still many winters. But with climate change, with long series of mild winters and lots of good forage available, deer populations just boomed in other parts of the state where you don't get deep, persistent snow. And the lower Hudson Valley, Long Island are particularly hard hit, and that's where we've seen some of the highest deer densities in the state.
Paul, you had mentioned commercial hunting, but what
I
is that
mentioned that.
exactly?
Yeah, commercial hunting would be what's been proposed where a state agency would license professional hunters to come in and remove deer from specific zones that they determined the deer were overabundant. So there would still be regular hunting in more rural parts of the state as always has been, but they would declare urban deer management zones and have licensed professionals come in and remove deer. And by doing it under USDA guidelines, the meat then could be sold on the open market. Right now, it's not legal to sell venison. You can give it away, but you can't sell it. But under the proposed laws and regulations, that it would potentially somebody with a commercial deer license then could sell venison at the going market price to recoup costs for their program efforts. But that legislation has been proposed in a couple of states. It's never been passed. So at this point, it's an idea that's never been implemented.
Okay, thank you. Do you know about a disease that is affecting the deer population in one area of the state?
Yeah, that's episodic hemorrhagic disease is the disease that's affecting deer this year. We always used to consider that a southern deer disease because it's spread by biting midges, blood biting insects from deer to deer, and it's very common in the southern states. But again, as we have milder falls, that disease tends to move northward each summer. And some years like this year, as it gets into Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, and locally, literally hundreds of deer can die from the hemorrhagic disease that's spread by these biting insects. As soon as you get a good hard frost, it kills the insects and the disease stops. And so that's another disease with climate change that has local impacts. It's usually not widespread. It's just usually pockets here and there in a couple different spots in the state.
Okay. Actually, we have somebody on tonight, Stan Pascu, who is a hunter and an instructor for gun and bow. Stan, did you want to say anything? Maybe not.
Stan's still muted. You see
Yeah.
Stan, but he's
Okay, now, how about now?
how about the word, Stan?
Okay. Yeah, I am the master instructor in Rockland County for gun and bow, as well as the county coordinator for the DEC. I'm also on the State Fish and Wildlife Management Board, the Conservation Council. I brought the venison program down to this part of the state, and I'm the president of Federation in the county. And Suzanne, you and I have interacted many years ago.
Yep.
Trying to get deer hunting open in Rockland. It's a serious problem. Yeah, I was out hunting about an hour ago in Rockland, but there's not one public inch of hunting land in Rockland. Not 1 inch, as green as this county is. But yes, there are areas where, if you know where and the parameters of legality, we do hunt. Private property where we have the permission, things like that. But in Rockland, we kind of run into stone walls. We have a lot of community opposition, political opposition at times. So it is a very big problem here. Not to say again that we don't have hunting, we do. We have 5 towns in the county, and Clarkstown, Ramapo is archery only, as long as you follow the parameters of 150 feet from an occupied dwelling, unless you have permission of the owner, 250 for a crossbow. And Stony Point, actually, if I'm not mistaken, still allows shotgun. But again, that's few and far between because a shotgun would be 500-foot area. So again, we do have it. Theoretically, according to DEC, about 200 deer are reported every year to be taken illegally. Not to say that there's probably a lot more that are taken. But again, I've been trying to get the county and somehow the individual areas somehow to allow legitimate hunters to be able to access more properties. It's just that we've come across, hit a stone wall with that. And we were severely affected here in Hudson Valley with EHD. The whole Hudson Valley, there was well over 1,000 reported dead deer, and that's just the reported ones. And I collect the heads for CWD in the county, and we're still collecting, as you well know. CWD is chronic wasting disease, and even though we haven't had any instances of it, the state is still collecting heads for it, and that's one of my jobs. So if anybody ever has any questions, they can feel free to contact me, at least county-wise.
And how would they contact you, Stan?
I can give you my phone number or email. It doesn't matter. I can do that now if you want.
You could put it in the chat.
Okay.
That would be
And-
great.
Okay. And also, I'm the big proponent of the venison program. I actually brought it down to this part of the state right after 9/11, where we donated 2,000 pounds to the city food banks. And I'll do everything in my power to be able to access deer from the county so that we can give it to the food banks. So, like I said, anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me.
Thank you very much, Stan.
Okay.
Paul, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned this is an issue along the entire East Coast, is there any discussion of regional efforts to address the problem?
No,
states get
because
together?
state regulations vary so much. It's a state by state
Okay.
issue. And
Okay.
so in New York State, we do things differently than they do in Pennsylvania, different laws, different regulations, different seasons. New Jersey does things differently again. So again, every state's got their own set of regulations. So even though the region as a whole, the deer biologists get together and discuss, hey, how can we work collectively to solve this program? You still got to work within the state guidelines and state laws and regulations, which vary state by state.
Okay. There is a question. I think it's this person is asking about deer sterilization methods. Is there anything besides surgery? I'm wondering if that was the sense of this question.
Yes, there are vaccines registered besides surgery. I tested them initially, both gonadotropin releasing hormone vaccine and porcine zonopollucida vaccine. Humane Society of the United States has a EPA registration for the PZP vaccine. USDA National Wildlife Research Center has a federal EPA registration for the gonadotropin releasing hormone vaccine that I tested. Right now, neither of those are available in New York State because they're not state registered. Even though they're federally registered, they're not state registered, just like any other pesticide would be. And so you would still, if you were going to use them, we'd have to work locally with DEC and obtain a research permit to actually conduct a research program to get access to either of those two vaccines. That's how we tested them in the past. I discourage their use because they're, in the long run, they'll cost more than surgical sterilization.
Wow.
Even though the vaccine itself doesn't seem very costly. For $100 to $200 a dose, you can dart and treat a deer. The problem is, just like any other vaccine, they need boosters. And so you can treat a deer this year, and if you've got a one-shot vaccine, it'll get you through this breeding season, but then it's got to be treated again next fall. And so there's another cost, assuming you can even get it within dart range a second time, because that deer is smarter now. It's been darted once. And so the advantage of surgery, you have a bigger upfront cost, but you only have to handle the deer once in its lifetime. Once it's surgically sterilized, you're done with it. So in the long term, you don't have to worry about maintenance and trying to boost them every year. And that's what really caused immunocontraceptive vaccines to fail, is the delivery system. It's far too expensive to either hand inject or try to dart a deer every year at a free ranging population. You just can't keep them on a boosting schedule. They get too wary.
Okay. So here's a question related to other kind of wildlife conflicts. Are there any turkey management programs underway?
There are turkey management programs. Again, I recommend contacting DEC regional staff. Believe down in your area, probably the New Paltz office would probably be the closest DEC office. Actually, turkey numbers are down from what they used to be several years ago. And DEC, their biologists are part of a multi-state turkey telemetry study that's been ongoing for a couple of years. They may be wrapping that up fairly soon, but I would contact DEC biologists in the New Paltz office there in the Hudson Valley if you've got specific questions about turkeys or turkey damage issues.
Okay. And then another one, we now have black bear in the county. So someone asked, would an electric fence repel a black bear who raids beehives?
The answer to that is usually yes, but the fence has to be done properly. What I've seen occasional problems, and you get a really dry year when the soil is not conducting current like this. Remember, all electric fences need to be grounded properly. So if you don't get full current, a bear can punch through an electric fence, and they have. But on a normal year with a properly constructed fence, you can significantly reduce bear problems at beehives. That's the technique that's usually recommended to keep bears out of hives. And there are a number of different designs. It's not that expensive. A good high voltage fence charger, farm supply store probably cost around $100 to $150. And fencing materials, polywire, fiberglass post, insulators, that's all very inexpensive. So you could probably do a fairly large group of hives for under $200 and have a fairly effective bear-proof fence that will keep bears out of the hives.
Okay. And finally, someone asked, and maybe you or Stan could answer this, why doesn't the county open some kind of hunting, do you think, in county parks? Is it because they're so small, relatively speaking, or?
Now, parks don't have to be large to hunt. It's probably just more public perception than anything that people feel that, parks are for recreation. They're concerned about safety. They're probably concerned that a child might see a hunter dragging a deer out of the woods. I've heard that before. But all this can be done with carefully selecting hunters and with skilled hunters. Many parks are hunted. It's just, again, local perception, I think, against hunting in many cases.
If I may interject, Suzanne?
Sure, of course, Stan.
Yeah, years ago when we did try it, that's exactly what happened. That there was too much opposition. We couldn't come across with any parks that theoretically had an extra added buffer zone to the 150 feet. Because we did this pre-crossbow, so it was the 150-foot, or back then it might have even been 250 for longbow. But there was too much opposition, and it was a political hot potato. So the Parks Department decided that it wasn't worth it to try to take the chance.
Yeah, the only way you might turn that around is to work with department and try to actually get some data on the damage that deer are doing to the natural plant communities, and use the argument that we're getting overrun with invasive species. We're losing sensitive wildflowers. We're losing our forest understory, and our parks aren't going to be parks in 100 years unless we do something about the deer issue. And I know that's worked in some other areas to allow a pilot program, and don't start with a huge program. Start with a few select individuals and start small to show that it can be done safely. We've done that in a couple of communities that have been very opposed to hunting, and just come in with a pilot program with 4 or 5 people, and just to show people that it can be done safely. And then once the elected officials realize that, they're willing to allow other private landowners to volunteer their property around the park, and then all of a sudden you've got more huntable area and it can be more effective.
Yeah, again, with that, Westchester did that, and they had they have a great program going. So it can be done, and it was done very close to us. So.
Thank you, Stan.
Okay.
Paul, one last question. Can you talk a little bit about deer migration? Because you mentioned that you had lowered the density, and then new deer evidently came into the area, moved in.
Right, that's not migration per se. That's just local movements of deer.
Okay.
Deer dispersal. Yeah, every spring when the adult doe gets ready to have her new fawns, she kicks last year's fawns out of her home range so she can devote her home range to her new offspring. And so you've got young deer wandering the landscape, and from having hundreds of tag deer over the year, we found that the average dispersal distance for a buck or a doe is usually in the 10 to 12 mile range. So from where they're born, they're probably going to set up their home range within 10 to 12 miles. Sometimes we see an occasional doe or buck that sticks around and sets up their home range right next to mom. That's sort of the exception to the rule, but it does happen. And we see occasional long distance wanderers. We had one 2 years ago, we had one of our tag deer from Fort Drum that went 120 miles to set up its home range.
Wow.
And that's the longest documented deer movement of a tagged deer in New York State. And one of our other deer from Fort Drum crossed the St. Lawrence River somehow and went to Canada. It was a buck that was harvested in Canada that we tagged on Fort Drum 3 years ago. And
Wow.
so occasionally they go a long way, 50 to 100 miles or more, but most of the dispersal is relatively local. And so when I was talking about immigration, what that is that we've reduced deer density in the area. So local deer that are more abundant nearby are just sort of filtering into the gap that we created.
And one other question related to that, Paul, what is a typical lifespan for a deer?
Typical lifespan in a non-hunting area is 12, 13 years. We've got several of our tagged does on campus that I marked 13, 14 years ago, and they still alive and kicking. It surprises me. They learn how to avoid running in front of a car and learn how to avoid hunters. They can live 12, 13, 14 years. I think the longest documented lifespan of a deer is close to 20 years for a tagged animal. But in the wild and even in urban settings where food's good, to get to 13, 14 is really ancient. We usually stop our population models at 12 because almost no deer go beyond 12 years.
All right, does anybody else have any last questions? Last call. All right, well, Paul, thank you so very much. This was excellent.
I'm glad to help out.
I think we all learned a lot, and who knows, Stan, maybe you'll come back to the legislature with new data and try to convince them of opening up some county lands.
I'd love to.
All right, Charlie, if you could please show our evaluation. And we're asking people to give us some feedback.
So what's going to happen is when you close the window, there should be a pop-up in a web browser with the survey. But if that doesn't happen in about 5 minutes, Suzanne's going to email out the link to you as well. You don't have to do it twice. If you get the pop-up, do it in the pop-up. If you don't get the pop-up, please go to your email and check for the link.
Thanks everyone for your attention. I appreciate being able to talk with folks in Rockland from a distance this evening.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us, Paul. We really enjoyed it, learned a lot.
Have a good evening.
Take care, be well.